Hello, AP and CCP US history students. Today we're going to talk about Reconstruction. Reconstruction is not just the physical rebuilding of the South and in some parts of the North, but it was also the kind of restructuring of the United States government to invite the South back in and what that was going to look like. For many cases, it was how the economy was going to look post-Civil War. So it was a very complex time, and as we talked about in the very last video, we talked about how Lincoln's death had a tremendous amount to do with the kind of stalling of kind of the patchwork of bringing the nation back together. Whereas some people in the North were willing to invite these folks back in and were willing to kind of let bygones be bygones after the conflict for the most part. It was vengeance about Lincoln's assassination that drove many of those people to now switch over and side with a group known as the Radical Republicans, who we'll talk about here in a second. So again, Reconstruction, a time period that mostly is from 1865 in April, when the war kind of grinds down to a slow termination here, till about 1877. And we're going to kind of talk about why those years were a little rough, to say the least, and an abject failure when it came to a stated purpose of what they were trying to do and what they actually did. So needless to say, there were some issues. First of all, what do you do at the tail end of the Civil War with somebody like Jefferson Davis? Jefferson Davis, who had been a member of the cabinet of Franklin Pierce. He had been a member of the Senate. He had represented Mississippi in the United States government in multiple facets. Now he had basically been public enemy number one in the fact that he was the president of the Confederacy. And if you're going to talk about the Confederates being traitors to the United States, which they were, Jefferson Davis is traitor number one. He's traitor in chief. He's the guy that was the face of the government. So what do? Do you make an example out of him? Do you kind of forgive him first and kind of show the model that, hey, we're going to forgive everybody? Do you punish him and then let other people off? You know, what do you do with him? The first thing is they had to catch him, and they finally did catch him, basically running from authorities, if you will, and trying his best to hide out. There were all kinds of stories about, they found him wearing women's clothing and trying to hide. And in the end, basically what ended up happening is Jefferson Davis was taken into custody by a band of military cavalrymen. And he was put into a prison, basically, into a prison camp. It wasn't like he was, in a terrible camp or anything. He was actually held in a fort and kind of had his own little apartment. His wife was allowed to stay with him, which I don't know if that's really the best thing to, hey, I want my wife to stay with me in jail. But Jefferson Davis was treated civilly. But again, it was, what do you do with him? And it took him almost 2 years to figure out that they were going to basically give him a pardon, but kind of tell him you're going to go back down to the South and you're not going to serve within the government anymore, which he didn't really want to. He was burned out by all this stuff anyway. But Jefferson Davis is going to be held as kind of public enemy number one and take the brunt of the blame, both North and South. There are Southerners who also blame him for the capitulation of the Confederacy during the Civil War as well. So he kind of almost is saved from the standpoint that he was removed from society for a little while. Be what it is, there is the very real concern of what do you do with the devastation and the destruction that actually was the Southern economy? What do you do with places like Atlanta and Savannah that had been torched by William Tecumseh Sherman in his storming of Atlanta and his eventual march to the sea? And he had torched the countryside too. He had burned plants, he had destroyed railroads, he had basically ripped up the South. And these are pictures right here of Richmond, the southern capital in Virginia. What do you do with these cities that had been laid siege to and totally destroyed? What do you do with the railroad lines? What do you do with the plantations? And then what do you do with the destruction of the Southern economy? Because not only are you freeing the slaves and depriving them of their primary source of labor, it's not like you can just replace them with, strapping young men, because a number of them have died in the war. So there's an absence of young males in the South to continue the economy and to continue the social structure as well. And look, the attitudes of the North and the South, not surprisingly, they're still very split. Just because the North wins, the Union wins, doesn't mean the South accepts it. And the Southerners are going to change, and they're going to adopt in time a lost cause theory. And this is going to be played up in history textbooks for years to come and become part of like the dogma of the United States almost, that the Southerners didn't really lose. Their mindset didn't lose. It was just, they ran out of the tools of war, and they kind of, ran out of uh, you know the bullets and the armaments and soldiers in general. They didn't run out of their zeal for their cause. So they kind of were rewriting history, and it was one of the few times where the victor doesn't really just write the narrative, because usually when the Allies win World War II, England, United States, France, they kind of make the narrative what they want. They tell the story from the standpoint of what they want. When somebody asks, hey, who was the biggest genocidal leader of World War II, most people will jump to Hitler because that was the narrative that was put out there. Never mind that Stalin actually killed more people over his reign than Hitler did. Granted, neither of them are good people, don't get me wrong, but when you win, you get to like rewrite the history the way you want the perspective to be. That didn't quite happen in the American Civil War. Yes, the American Civil War, when the textbooks are written, the North is justified in what they do because they win. But it's not like they completely condemn the South. And the South kind of gets that with that narrative coming out of it. And their attitude is, we didn't really lose as much as we just had to give up, which is an awkward way of looking at it, but that's how they do. And they also kind of talk about how the Southern society doesn't really have to change, that the economy changes, of course, and the politics may change a little bit, but they almost kind of go to a status quo mentality as they go through Reconstruction, which irks a number of people in the North, especially abolitionists, because they do want to see people have to pay for what they had done. There are some retributionists that want some things done to these people in the South. So when the topic of what to do with slaves comes up, obviously emancipation had been Lincoln's kind of contribution to this whole thing. He was the great emancipator. Not only did he fight for the Emancipation Proclamation in January of 1863, he backed it up with a 13th Amendment being passed right before his death and then ratified later on that year. So the 13th Amendment now outlawed slavery throughout the United States. And even the states that were coming in back into the Union had to accept the 13th Amendment. We'll kind of get to that here in a bit. But that's just one facet. Okay, so you've freed the slaves. Now what do you do with them? Do they have equal rights? How do they fit into the economy? How do they fit into society? Do they have the right to vote? Do they have, certain social standing? Where do they fit in the grand scheme of things? So you have this new ex-slave society, and keep in mind, in most places of the South, it was illegal for them to be taught to read and write. So you have a very large illiterate population of African Americans hitting the workforce. There's no job outside of what they were already doing. If you worked on a plantation in a cotton heavy area of the South, and the only job that was available was to pick cotton, there are a number of them that are just going to say, well, I'll just stay here and I'll work on the plantation. And some of them had good relationships with the family that was there. They didn't mind being in that farm if they were treated correctly and if they were no longer forced to stay there. But of course, there's also a new slave society where there are slaves who are saying, well, I'm free now and I'm going to go out and try and find my own job, or I'm going to go move and see what else this land has to offer, because they've never left their plantation. Some of them leave to, of course, find family members, because during times of slavery, and especially right before the Civil War, there was a lot of buying and selling slaves, which ripped families apart. So there were slaves that kind of said, well, I want to go find my wife, or I want to go find my children. I want to go find my parents, So again, there's this kind of forced new society. And a number of the slaves also start to say, well, the first thing I want to do is I want to learn how to read, or the first thing I want to do is buy my own set of clothing, because I've always been kind of provided it. So I want to, kind of buy my own clothes, which is kind of hard to do after the war, because the war had depleted the supply of everything, including cloth, which is highly ironic that the guys who had been picking cotton for years, there wasn't enough cotton fabric with which to actually provide them with new options for clothing. So there's all kinds of differences, but you're also going to also see things in society where, and you'll see this a little bit nowadays too. I'm not sure if um, some of you students have noticed, but there's a big push within the African American community to be called Mister or Miss. That's a big deal, and a number of the slaves have never had last names before. They've never had a title, and that was a big deal because, when they were working on the plantation owner was, Mr. O'Hara, and maybe the lady of the plantation, if you watch Gone with the Wind, is Miss Scarlet. Like there was this mentality that you called them by their given name, and you call them by a title. Well, a lot of African Americans had always just been called, sadly, very demeaning things like boy or girl, or they'd been called by a first name and nothing else. So a number of them are going to adopt last names, and it's not surprising they go with the names that they know. A number of African Americans are going to choose the last name Lincoln. A number of them are going to choose Grant. Some of them are going to choose things even like Southern leaders like Lee or Jackson. Even though they were Southern leaders, they were in the newspaper. These were common English last names. So they will adopt a number of very common last names of American heroes. They'll pick up names. Some of them are going to use last names like Turner because of Nat Turner. Some of them are going to use Douglas because of Frederick Douglass. So there's going to be kind of this adoption of last names because these are, of course, not African last names. The amount of African Americans inside the country with last names that are predominantly English, English or Irish. There aren't too many English and Irish Africans. So not surprisingly, these people are taking their titles during that time period so that they can be called Mr. Jackson. It's a very important thing. And I've even seen quite a bit of this in African American society of even naming their child Mr., naming their son Mr. because they want their child to be respected. And again, it's ingrained in culture, unfortunately, because of this society back in the day. Now, trying to help these people out will be something known as the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is put in place. It's the idea that they're going to have a bureau that comes down and reassigns farmland to ex-slaves so they can get a head start. They're going to, obviously install schooling and other support services. It's basically supposed to be a social network or a social services kind of wing of the government to try and help out ex-slaves. The problem is it's run by pretty scandalous people. It's run by people that, instead of using the money for what they're supposed to be, reallocating land or training African Americans to kind of be their own boss or run their own household or whatever else, run their own farm, the people who are running it are pretty scandalous individuals who are going to divert that money to their friends, to their family, to themselves, and very little of it gets to the actual African American community that they're supposed to be supporting. At the same time, you start seeing Southern whites start realizing, all right, the economy's changed. The society has changed. What can we do to make sure that the society doesn't change too much and that we still end up on top? And so they start putting in place what are known as the Black Codes. Now, the Black Codes are the precursor to what eventually becomes known as Jim Crow. We'll get to Jim Crow in a bit, but Black Codes basically are the idea that local governments are going to try and find a way to limit voting rights. They're going to try and limit social rights within society and social standing. They're going to try and limit financial gains, if you will. They're going to try and kind of skew the law to benefit whites over blacks. And it's not surprising that that happens. The surprising part is how much the federal government allows them to get away with on this idea that, well, states get to run their own elections, or states get to run their own banking system, or they get to run their own, social structures. And it just kind of entrenches what the South had been saying prior to the Civil War, which feeds that whole lost cause mentality that their cause had never really died, even though they had lost the war. So, not surprisingly, why do they get away with this? Well, Andrew Johnson, who takes over for Lincoln upon Lincoln's assassination, is not Abraham Lincoln. He is very different. He's probably the polar opposite of Lincoln. His characteristics, Lincoln is self-taught. Lincoln is somebody that was raised without formal schooling. Well, so was Andrew Johnson. The difference is Lincoln, tries to read as much as he possibly can, and tries to educate himself and finds a legal standing and a legal profession on his own. Works his way up. Johnson basically becomes a menial worker. He goes off and becomes a tailor. But even that, when he apprentices to be a tailor, he's in Tennessee, he's in the backwoods of Tennessee, and he's got a pretty mean tailor that he's assigned to. So he breaks free from that tailor. He basically runs away, and kind of opens his own tailor shop, if you will, and works his way up that way. And he finds that he has a gift of talking in front of people, and that's pretty much the only comparison between him and Lincoln that's really accurate. They both have a talent of standing up in front of people and saying the right things. The difference is that Johnson kind of says things with a booming voice, and he's kind of, bubbly and kind of like the halftime speech type of thing, whereas Lincoln's more pondering and he's very eloquent in his delivery. So, very good speakers, just different types. Now, as a politician, Johnson gains a tremendous amount of respect because he's somebody from Tennessee who never left the Union. He had served in the Senate for Tennessee. When Tennessee goes and secedes from the Union, Johnson basically swears he's not leaving, and he never left. And so, of course, he gains a tremendous amount of political capital by doing that because he goes against his home state. So when Tennessee is retaken by Grant's forces in the West, Johnson is put in charge of basically being the governor of the conquered territory. And he cracks down hard on the Southern elites. Why? He's not one of them. He's never liked them. He's poor. He grew up poor. He's not a plantation owner. And even though he had owned slaves, it's not like he had a 250 person plantation. He had owned a couple of slaves to help him around the tailor shop. So Johnson basically doesn't like anybody that's wealthy. He's not on their side by any stretch. He thinks that this war was brought on by wealthy elites and no other reason. So Johnson basically rules Tennessee with an iron fist. So not surprisingly, in 1864, when Abraham Lincoln is running for re-election and the Republicans say, hey, it would be really good to have somebody kind of balance the ticket a little bit, they wanted a Union man. They wanted somebody that stood for all the United States. And so they settled on Johnson, even though Johnson used to be a Democrat. So he's not a traditional Republican. So think very much like John Tyler. If you remember back when William Henry Harrison was running, they wanted Tyler because he was a defect from the Jacksonian Democrats to the Whig Party. So he was never really a Whig, but he wasn't a Jacksonian Democrat. So that's why they went with him. Johnson, same deal here. He wasn't really a Republican, but he was a Unionist, and that was good enough. At no point did they think that Lincoln was going to die, because when Lincoln is shot, everybody kind of looks and goes, oh my God, Johnson is president. And the reason they have that is even at the inauguration, Johnson is absolutely drunk. Now, the reason is he was running a fever. He was not feeling well. And back then, a lot of people, when they would get sicknesses like that, even doctors would prescribe them alcohol and say, hey, you should probably drink. And why? Because, the doctor would tell you that now. If you got the flu or if you got, a pretty bad sinus infection, they would tell you, hey, keep the fluids up. Well, keep in mind, this is a time period where you don't have a Brita water filter or something. Water was pretty dangerous. So the simplest thing to keep the water in your system is to drink some alcohol. And sometimes it dulls the pain. They didn't have Motrin back then. So, hey, drink up and you won't feel it anymore. So Johnson basically drinks himself into oblivion the night before the inauguration. And that morning when he wakes up with a hangover and he's not feeling very well, even his friend comes by and says, well, maybe you should take a couple of shots. It'll make you feel better, take the edge off. The problem is when he takes the shots, he actually gets drunk again. So when he goes to the inauguration and they ask him to speak, he speaks incoherently for about 20 minutes. Nobody bothers to cut him off. There are some in the Republican Party that want him to be embarrassed, and they're hoping maybe that would be something that convinces him to either resign or just not take a position within the administration. So Johnson basically comes into the presidency, to be fair, a little, he's not exactly popular. And of course, he was unpopular because he wasn't Lincoln. So when Lincoln dies, there is a great fear about what's going to happen moving forward. And they had legitimate fears about this because whereas Lincoln was willing to bring people in on what was known as a 10% plan, the radical Republicans and people like Johnson were not. The 10% plan was pretty simple. The idea was is that 10% of those that were registered voters in 1860, which means when Lincoln was president, when Lincoln was elected first, the 10% plan was the idea that we will allow the states in when 10% of those voters pledge allegiance to the Union. Now, that may seem very, very low, but Lincoln realized in 4 years of war, there were a lot of those voters that probably died on the battlefield, and there were a ton of them that had not quite understood that they had lost the war. So, in his mind, to invite them back in the Union, 10% of those voters was good enough. There are a number of radical Republicans in the Wade Davis bill of 1864. Those Republicans are going to say, you know what, that's not good enough. They're going to want 50%. And even people like Lincoln are going to say, that's not possible because not only you have death, but you also have people that are just not willing to capitulate and admit defeat. So you have the moderates who really were Lincoln and the radicals who were people like Johnson. Now, Johnson wasn't a radical Republican by any stretch, but Johnson wanted to punish the South. And there were radical Republicans under the leadership of people like Thaddeus Stevens, and Wade and Davis, obviously. Like, these were the people that were kind of trying to go after the South. Johnson's plan kind of ends up being moderate in between these two plans when Lincoln dies. Johnson kind of realizes, hey, Lincoln was probably onto something. We probably need to invite the states back in. The irony is that when Lincoln proposes the 10% plan, nobody questions his loyalty or his unity or his patriotism. But when Johnson does it, it's, oh, well, you're Southern. Of course you want to do that. So literally Johnson's in a no-win situation when it comes to Reconstruction. And of course, the Confederacy in Congress, as soon as some of these states start to admit themselves back into the Union, they start sending people to Congress. Well, some of the people they're sending to Congress were in the Confederate government. People like Alexander Stephens, if you remember reading the Cornerstone speech, he was the vice president of the Confederacy, and he was elected then to come back into the Senate by Georgia. And the Congress says, we're not going to sit you. You're a rebel. You have no right to sit here. So they're kind of saying, look, you're traitors. At no point, you're felons. You're out. You can't sit. So there were a number of issues with who could actually be accepted into Congress because every state seemingly was doing it differently. Some were actually admitted back into the Union and allowing African Americans to vote right off the bat, which led to the first African Americans to serve in the House and the Senate. There were some states that were using the black codes to limit the ability of African Americans to vote in the state elections. So, this is going to be a problem. And Johnson, when he's clashing with Congress, is going to bring up those things. He's going to bring up the fact that you're punishing the South for being the South. You're punishing, the war is over, move on. And some people are not ready to move on. So it's not surprising that in the congressional elections of 1866, they get murdered. And what I mean by that is the moderates, the people that are kind of like trying to work with Johnson, they get murdered by the radical Republicans. So what the American people, at least in the North, were saying is, hey, we want you to go after these guys. We want the South to be punished. That was kind of what they were getting out of the tenor of the election of 1866. So not surprisingly, Reconstruction changes tenor pretty quickly. And so now you have radical Reconstruction, also known as Reconstruction by the sword, where they basically divide up the South into districts, occupied districts, and they basically rework the state constitutions to where now you have to, hey, if you're coming back into the Union, you have to admit that you're going to follow the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendment. So the Civil War amendments, which means abolition of slavery, the citizenship of former slaves, as well as anybody who is a citizen inside the United States, which is equal protection under the law. And then finally, the African Americans, at least males, right to vote. All of those had to be certified by your states coming back into the Union, which of course is a tough pill to swallow for many of these states that are trying to keep the white man on top. And we're subscribing to that lost cause philosophy. So you're going to get some pretty weird responses from these state governments about how they're going to institute their policies moving forward. And of course, this is a time period again where we're going to start seeing an influx of African American House members and senators. which gives a false sense of comfort to many of the people in the North that, hey, not only did we abolish slavery, but we're now reformatting and readjusting the Southern society. That is going to be a false positive, because just a few years later, they're going to revert and go to Jim Crow laws. So weirdly enough, this Reconstruction by the sword is actually going to push the South further into trying to kind of protect the South and the Southern way of life. So, not surprisingly, when African Americans are granted the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, and they start to elect people to the House and the Senate, or more importantly, to the state houses and to the local governments, when they start electing African Americans, the whites feel like somehow they've been trampled upon, the don't tread on me philosophy. So, it's not surprising that the White League is going to form, and the Ku Klux Klan, which is, of course, known better to your generation. The creation of the Ku Klux Klan, along with all these other organizations, were formed by white people who felt like they were being defeated in society now. They lost on the battlefield, but now they're being defeated at home, and they're basically being told they don't have the same rights anymore. Now, keep in mind, their version of their rights were, this idea that somehow they ruled over everything, that they were the masters. That's not the case. They were having a hard time swallowing this equality thing, and of course, the Union troops that were there and enforcing those policies were enforcing it on them without really explaining to them and guaranteeing them that equality meant that everybody has an equal say. They were just not willing to accept it. So, not surprisingly, a group of people led by a old Confederate war general, a guy named Nathan Bedford Forrest. If you've ever watched Forrest Gump, he's mentioned within the first 5 minutes of the film. But Nathan Bedford Forrest, who again was a Confederate cavalry commander and widely considered to be the best soldier in the South, at least, he basically, along with his followers, formed the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan was an idea that white people would band together to protect white interests from the incursion of African Americans within the society, the politics, and the economics of the local Southern states, the local Southern governments, whatever you want to kind of point to. And they, of course, do a great deal of damage and eventually are labeled a terrorist organization. And they are pretty mean-spirited people. Believe it or not, however, the Ku Klux Klan of the early 1900s, the kind of rebirth of the Klan that we'll talk about, is actually worse in many facets. Neither group is very nice. They're pretty awful individuals, but they go about it in different ways. And look, the formation of these groups was fear tactics and scare tactics to try and keep African Americans from gaining any sort of social or political or especially economic foothold within the reconstructed South. And it was all a response to Reconstruction. It was all a response to kind of the bumbling of the Northern government trying to institute these policies without at least including the white Southerners and trying to explain on the aggregate what they were trying to do. To be fair, I don't think the white Southerners were going to listen regardless of what they did. Needless to say, when Johnson starts trying to push for some Reconstruction policies that were not exactly popular with the radical Republicans, he ends up getting impeached. Now, why was he impeached? It was pretty shady, to say the least. Johnson gets impeached because he basically pushes for firing a government official that he disagreed with. And when he fires him, it was a violation of a law that they had just passed. And they basically told Johnson that he didn't have the right to fire anybody in his cabinet, which nobody had ever told a president they couldn't do that. In fact, Lincoln had been firing people all throughout the Civil War, including multiple generals. So Johnson kind of says, you're telling me I can't fire a government official? Well, I guess I'm going to have to challenge you on it. So he ends up firing somebody. When that happens, he gets basically put on trial. He is impeached. And remember, impeachment just means bringing up on charges. They basically charged him with violation of a congressional law. He gets put on trial, and by one vote, he keeps his office. Because keep in mind, you have to have a 2/3 vote. By one vote in the Senate, he keeps his office. He's the closest we've ever had to being thrown out of office. Okay. We'll see how this new impeachment happens with Trump, but this is the closest you ever came right here. Nixon probably would have been removed, but he resigned before anything ever happened. We'll get to that when we hit the 1970s. Now, of course, why was he innocent? This was kind of the Congress trying to find a way to remove the guy. They just didn't like him. So, not surprisingly, the next facet of this is at the end of it, he gets to keep his job, but he's basically a lame duck from the moment that happens to the next election cycle. Needless to say, we're going to talk about that when we talk about the Gilded Age. I don't want to belabor this too much, but what will happen in 1868, in the election of 1868, is Ulysses S. Grant is going to take over as president of the United States. He serves 8 years. He gets reelected. And remember, Grant was a Civil War general. And when he replaces Johnson, and this is, by the way, the last time the sitting president does not go and attend the inaugural. And it's not because Johnson didn't want to or, held, bad feelings for Grant. It's because Grant didn't want to ride in the same stagecoach with him. And Johnson basically says, well, if you're not going to be with me, then the heck with it. I'm not going. So it's really kind of just two men that didn't like each other. So it's very kind of similar to where we're at as we move into the inauguration this year between Trump and Biden. But bottom line is, it's been that long since the last time that's ever happened. Johnson leaves office basically in disgrace. Grant takes over and has a very tumultuous 8 years, which we'll talk about when we talk about the Gilded Age, because the Gilded Age is going on concurrently with Reconstruction. Reconstruction doesn't end until 1877 with the election, and I use air quotes, the election of Rutherford B. Hayes. We'll talk about that when we hit the Gilded Age, but bottom line is that is the worst trade in American history. The North got Rutherford B. Hayes as president. The South got to basically institute Jim Crow laws and put African Americans back into virtual slavery. So you want to talk about a terrible trade that destroyed an entire group of people. That was the trade right there. The North got Rutherford B. Hayes. Many people couldn't pick him out of a lineup of historical figures if they tried, including historians. So needless to say, we'll talk about that when we hit the Gilded Age. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please reach out on this. Now, since some of you have held on this long, I want to point out that there is a quiz tomorrow, or a test tomorrow, over the Civil War and Reconstruction. And it looks like this. And you will notice that they are old AP questions. And you may want to take out your little notebook here. Since you were nice enough to hang on here, the belief by some Americans that the Civil War was a rich man's war but a poor man's fight was reflected in, that would be the New York City draft riots in 1863, because people were buying their way out of the draft. So wealthy people weren't having to go fight, while young people who were poor were basically being hired to take their spots. Which of the following statements about African American soldiers during the Civil War is correct? Let's see. It was this one. For the most of the war, they were paid less than white soldiers of equal rank. The goal of the American Colonization Society was to return freed slaves to Africa, to a place called Monrovia, which is in Liberia, named Liberty. There you go, Liberia, named for freed slaves. Members of the American Know Nothing Party of the 1850s typically supported restrictions on immigration. The Battle of Antietam, September 17th, 1862, is considered pivotal to the outcome of the Civil War because prevented the possibility of foreign invasion and intervention on behalf of the South. This basically eliminated the English or the French ever getting involved in the American Civil War. The Black Codes, passed in another southern states after the Civil War, were intended place limits upon the socioeconomic opportunities of blacks. You should know that from just the presentation you just watched. Historians have argued that all of the following were causes of the Civil War except that would be the growing power of poor Southern whites who resisted planter dominance and sought to abolish slavery. That didn't happen. That was the problem. The most controversial and divisive component to the Compromise of 1850 was the passage of a tougher National Fugitive Slave Act. The Compromise of 1877, we just talked about that, resulted in the withdrawal of federal troops from the South. It actually also allowed for Rutherford B. Hayes to become president of the United States. That was the trade-off. But without the troops there, the Southern blacks were at the mercy of the Southern whites, and that did not work out well for the blacks, obviously. After the Civil War, women reformers and former abolitionists were divided. And they were divided over the legislation that ensured voting rights of African American males, because the abolitionists basically said, yay, our job's done. And women said, well, wait a minute, we don't have the right to vote. And they went, just patience. Didn't work out well. The Supreme Court's decision in the Dred Scott case in 1857 effectively repealed the Missouri Compromise, got rid of that line that went through the bottom of Missouri out to the coast. It basically declared that to be unconstitutional. I'm going to skip the Lincoln quote here just because I don't want to read the whole darn thing. And the image, you're kind of on your own. You probably need to be able to do that one. So you're kind of on your own for those. During Reconstruction, which of the following was a change that took place in the South? The African Americans were able to exercise political rights, because some of them actually do go off and serve in Congress. In adopting the 14th Amendment, Congress was primarily concerned with protecting legislation guaranteeing civil rights to former slaves. Okay, because ending slavery was the 13th, guaranteeing all citizens the right to vote wasn't really true of any of the amendments, but at least 15th extended the right to vote to African Americans. And the Freedmen's Bureau was an act of Congress. It was not a constitutional amendment. Okay, the 14th Amendment is actually written out here. This provision overturned and it would be the Supreme Court decision of Dred Scott versus Sanford, because remember, the Dred Scott decision said that all slaves were property, that they were not actual human beings. The 14th Amendment negated that. And thank goodness, because that was the worst of any of the Supreme Court cases that are out there. The first attempt to apply the doctrine of popular sovereignty in determining the status of slavery occurred in, and you should know that out of all these states listed, Kansas is the only one that was part of Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was all about popular sovereignty. So Kansas would be the correct answer. 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution established, and it would be this one, that suffrage cannot be denied based on race, color, or previous servitude. Remember, suffrage means the right to vote. Okay, that should give you a head start here over your fellow classmates that didn't watch this video. If you have any questions over the rest of it, please reach out through office hours during class tomorrow or through email.